Welcome to Some Stutter.
Newfoundland and Labrador's first podcast
about communicating differently.
I'm Paul.
I'm Laura.
I'm Greg, and I'm a person who stutters. Welcome, Anne, to Some Stutter. And thank you very much for taking the time out to have a conversation with us this morning.
It's my great pleasure, Greg. Thank you.
You mentioned that you are legally blind, but prefers to be called visually impaired. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the term legally blind has a really interesting history. It dates back, well, it originates from conditions that existed during the Middle Ages, actually, in Europe, where people who had disabilities were literally living on the margins of communities. They were not integrated into communities at all and made their living often by begging for alms. They were the deserving poor who lived on the charity of others. After the second plague that swept through Europe, the numbers of people that required charity were so numerous that if you claimed to have a disability that was an invisible disability, as blindness is, you had to apply for a license that you would wear around your neck and which would identify you as a truly disabled person, a member of the worthy poor community, legally entitled to sit in a public square and beg for alms.
Mm.
That is why we don't have legal deafness or legal depression or legal paraplegia. But that
Okay.
term, legally blind, meaning that you have been validated by a magistrate, still persists.
Mm.
Isn't that interesting?
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, it's interesting. My God. So Anne, can you share a little about the history behind your sight loss for our listeners?
Sure. I was born with a congenital anomaly of the architecture of my eye, which left me extremely nearsighted from birth. And as I grew up, the connective tissue in my eye began to deteriorate. It's not treatable or fixable. Um, so as scarring occurred on the internal structure of my eye, I could no longer see through the scarring. I do have some sight, but I cannot read visually. I don't have facial recognition, so I keep meeting the same people over and over again. Obviously, once I get to know a person well, they will be filed in my Rolodex of voices. Um, but I have a sense of the big picture of what's around me, but detail is lost to me. I also don't have depth perception, which plays a big part in my mobility because a flight of steps, especially if they're all concrete, will look like a flat surface to me. An approaching
Mm.
car, I'll hear the car, I may see the lights, but I can't detect the distance at which the car is approaching. So,
Mm-hmm.
at a casual glance, my sight loss is not really evident, I don't think, to observers, other than the fact I have a guide dog at my side. But it's when you see me try to interact with text or something small. Sometimes in social situations, I experience a lot of social awkwardness because I cannot recognize who's around me. I may not be reading nonverbal communication in the same way others do, which may lead to me inappropriately interrupting somebody who's about to speak or being perceived as ignoring somebody when in fact I can't see them, things like that. But I've learned to navigate that with a sense of humor because it is what it is, and I don't want to feel any more stigmatized than institutions and systems make me feel. I don't want that in my interpersonal world as well. So I've learned to treat those situations with humor and also to relax the people around me because I think many of us, especially with invisible differences, um, the people around us who don't have those differences sometimes feel very hesitant to interact with us because they think there's some special approach they have to adapt, you know, which isn't always true. So that's kind of that's I think probably the best description of my visual circumstances.
Okay. So, Anne, can you share about your challenges with being a disability rights activist? What and my second question is what is your definition of ableism, and how has ableism impacted your quality of life? Now these are $64 questions.
Let's start with ableism.
Okay.
Um, Ableism can apply. It applies mostly. I use it mostly in an institutional or systemic context. I think in the same way that many of us acknowledge we live in a world that has been constructed with a white supremacy kind of position. We also live in a world that has been constructed around a certain perception of how a person should inhabit their body, how they should do things. You know, it's very what I call able centric. The world is built and governed, and many of our societies are too, around the assumption that we all inhabit our bodies in the same way. We all have typical brains. We all have four limbs. We all have ears and eyes that work. Um, we all communicate in the same manner. We all receive information and process it in the same manner. And particularly in the 20th century, the late 20th century and on into this century, we've learned that none of that is true. And in an institutional and systemic sense, our institutions very much still hold that assumption. So that somebody, as an example, I never graduated high school. Many people are very, very surprised to learn that, but I did not graduate high school because when I was in school, when I was a student in school who wasn't visually impaired, there were no accommodations for visually impaired children in schools. The only accommodation I ever received was the front desk in the classroom, which was fine when it came to study subjects because I've always been a very, very hungry reader. But I could not, math was always taught on blackboards, and I could never see the blackboard. I could never see what was happening. So once in my school experience, when we graduated beyond basic arithmetic, and where suddenly math included numbers and kind of more abstract concepts, because I could not see the manner of instruction, I never passed a math class after grade 9. So consequently, I don't have a high school diploma, which of course cast a pall and a shadow over my whole adult life and still does. Um, Despite that, and because of the fact that I am a very hungry reader, um, I consider myself an autodidact, a person who is self-educated, and my professional background is in arts administration, and thank God for the arts when it comes to people who are atypical in any way, because it's the one sector, particularly in our province, that's very open to differences and diversity. So I very accidentally landed a job, just a little like short time, yeah, very brief, like 12-week stint with St. Michael's Print Shop, which is a
Mm.
very renowned across the country and internationally visual arts organization as an archivist. I had to look the word up in the dictionary actually to apply for the job, but I got the job. And to make a long story short, I did very well in that workplace. And when my site crashed to the extent where I couldn't read and things without pretty heavy accommodations, when I left St. Michael's Print Shop, I had actually been the executive director there for close to a decade. So, and that was the last, aside from a couple of short contracts, I have not been able to access employment since. Wild.
Mm.
And just as a context for that, in Canada, people who live with sight loss have an unemployment rate of close to 70%.
That's terrible. That's terrible,
Isn't that
Anne.
wild?
Terrible.
Yeah.
My God.
So I used to be very ashamed of the fact that I hadn't graduated high school, but now I tell people because I often hear from others, you're such a great communicator, you boil things down really well, you're such a great teacher, you're such a great advocate, that essay was really good, that article was really good, you're so good with the media, all the things. And I tell them, I don't have a high school diploma. And there are hundreds or thousands of people just like me in this province who have been discriminated out of workplaces, who do not have the accommodations they need in schools. We're hearing a lot of that right now, like at present in our school system, with children who are neurodiverse in particular. Um, that situation has not changed very much in this province, but it is in no way like in this respect, formal education really is not a gauge at all of a person's potential and aptitude for learning. So that is the reason why I'm very, very upfront about that because I think it's really important that people understand the wealth of creative potential that is not being tapped into in our society because of the devaluation of the disabled or neurodiverse experience.
Mm. My God. Interesting, Anne. Interesting. So, Anne, to be honest with you, I was fascinating with all the work that you have done, and I mean I mean the all all of your advocacy work. So, would you would you be able to give our audience an overview of the content of this?
Absolutely. Um, I actually began to investigate uh, disability mostly because I was trying to understand my own experience. Because for many, many years, I did something that a lot of people with disabilities do. In my case, I passed as sighted. So I hid my disability. I did not disclose it. Um, and often in the workplace, I would bring my, because my interaction with print is more difficult than it would be if I was sighted, it takes me sometimes longer to accomplish certain tasks that are very text heavy. So I would conceal that by bringing work home, by spending more hours doing it, but nobody knew I was doing that. Like the end result was always good work, but for me, it would take longer to do it. When that no longer became possible, that's when employment got really, really like impossible to access. So I had the experience of being viewed by the people around me as being very typical, just like them. But then when that stopped happening, like it was a really strange, Greg. I literally left St. John's, went to Ottawa to train for a month with my guide dog. That's a residential kind of situation. So I went away for a month and I arrived back in the streets of St. John's with my guide dog. For many people who knew me casually, that was the first time that they saw me as a disabled person. And it was the first time I was viewed by institutions that I interact as a disabled person. Like back then, if you were going to perform, for example, a banking function, you would interact with a teller. Prior to me having my guide dog, I would go into a bank and the teller would speak to me like an adult, like I am an adult, and things would flow that way. But what I began to understand was that I was viewed very differently now than I had been before I had my guide dog, although I myself had not changed at all. My personality was exactly the same. Of cognition was exactly the same. My talents and skills and flaws were all exactly the same. Yet I was being communicated with very differently. I was being condescended to. I was being spoken to as if I were somehow not able to understand what people were trying to say to me. A lot of people thought I couldn't hear, um, that I was inept in some way, like all of the things. Then job interviews became absolutely excruciating. And I knew almost before I opened my mouth that I was not going to get this job. It was not going to happen. Um, which had, of course, an incredibly negative impact on my economic reality, and always will. Um, so all of that was going on. I think also in terms of institutions like I had attempted to receive support to go to university. And what I learned was that if you're a disabled person trying to attain post-secondary education, at least in the early 2000s, it was completely a matter of luck. It has to do with what government is in power, what programs they offer for financial support. Because if you're a 45-year-old person, um, your living expenses are going to, you know, it's you may not be in a situation where you want to move into a residence. You're not living like a 20-year-old student. You know, you have other obligations. You might have children, all these things. So, and you need to pay for accommodations. Um, I think I think many people in the Canadian public believe that if you have a disability, the things that you need, the accommodations that you need, things like wheelchairs, hearing aids, in my case, contact lenses, my guide dog, um, a lot of it computer technology that enabled me to read. The Canadian public, in my experience, assume that these things come to us as part of our universal health care. They do not. They do not. We have to pay for them ourselves. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, unlike many other provinces, there are no programs where you receive financial assistance for those accommodations. I have health insurance that I pay several $100s a month for that covers nothing to do with my sight loss because I was born this way, right?
My God.
Yeah. So my attempts to enter university were completely thwarted by all of those things. I feel I honestly feel that in Canada, it's okay. Like we have normalized disability poverty. We have normalized,
No, okay.
right? So it's very, very difficult to climb out. It just is. And a lot of it has, I'm sure that you know what I mean, and I'll explain this for people who may not. There's something in this world that many people with disabilities refer to as inspiration porn, where you might see a meme or hear a story about a disabled athlete who overcame many, many barriers to win an Olympic medal. And yes, that is absolutely worthy of respect and praise, etc. But with that kind of comes an assumption or a misunderstanding that any disabled person can rise up out of that disability and achieve all of the same things that non-disabled people can, and it's just not true. We
Mm,
can achieve many of those things, but we need tools that those non-disabled people do not need, and those tools are not available to us. We don't have the money. There are only another advocate I know who also has sight loss often puts it this way: there are only three ways to to bridge sight loss, to get sight. One is to beg for it, to seek a sighted guide to help you, to rent it, call a cab, rather than try to walk there or whatever it might be, or buy it. And if you don't have money, you don't have access. And that's why disability poverty is so serious.
you know, you have done a lot of advocacy work trying to put the needs of the disabled community, especially the visually impaired, under the lens of the government. Has there been any movement at all, or
No,
they're hearing you, but they're not really listening to you?
no,
Do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
yes. Helen Keller, in her acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, stated that the most oppressive force in the lives of people who have disabilities, and this was in the early 20th century, or no, the mid 20th century when she received the Nobel Prize. Even at that time, she identified the most oppressive force in the lives of disabled people was capitalism. And my experience in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Canada is that because we have been devalued, because there is no recognition of the actual potential that our community holds, which is considerable, um, there is very little invested in our community. We have and continue to be the the segment of the population that will receive what we receive, if we receive it, when resources permit. And I saw that very recently the City of St. John's published an accessibility plan. And in that accessibility plan, literally every single clause, every single initiative that they were undertaking with regard to wheelchair accessibility, sight accessibility, hearing accessibility, autism accessibility, and so on and so on and so on. Every single initiative was um, was modified with that phrase, where and when resources permit. We are
Mm,
30% of the population, and also well, if you look at even, for example, there is a federal disability benefit that is going to begin being dispersed, I think, in the summer of this year. The national organization Disability Without Poverty has been advocating for at least 8 years for that federal disability benefit because so many people with disabilities live in poverty. And they were proposing what would basically function as a universal basic income for all persons with disabilities. And what was actually approved by our legislature was a $200 a month federal disability benefit for working age people only. So
Mm,
even that tiny
I see.
amount of money excludes children, excludes seniors, right? It's all about the worker, the worker, the worker. So on the one hand, they deny us access to the education and skill sets that would make us somewhat more appealing to the employer, because I know lots of people, I'm sure you do too, in our community who have degrees, who have postgraduate degrees, and
True.
still find it almost impossible to find work in this province. Um, so, that's capitalism for you. The same is true in Newfoundland and Labrador. Our premier announced a $400 a month disability benefit in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is great for those who can get it. But again, only for working age. Only the potential worker is ever acknowledged. So there's that. There is definitely the normalization of disability poverty. It's an expectation. It's a given that disability comes with poverty unless you come from a background of economic privilege. I know when I ran for city council, some of the ways in which people interacted with me, and I don't mean the public, I mean other candidates, some incumbents on council, um, was atrocious. This sort of condescension and what do you know sort of attitude. Um, on the other hand, I, I did something that had never been tried before. I knocked down, I and my team, but I was with my team every step of the way. I personally knocked on 4,000 doors. I couldn't bring my guide dog along for the ride because it was too hard on the dog. And to
Mm-hmm.
my amazement, the people who surrounded me and became my campaign team, because I don't have a workplace, right? So and I don't have a lot of money. So do not have the same networks that a well-known person in our city would
Definitely.
have. I don't have access to those donors, right? But the people who did surround me, the vast majority of them are under 40. A lot of international students who can't even vote in the city, but who could see the value of what I was trying to do. A lot of other people who either have disabilities or have friends, neighbors, coworkers, or family with disabilities. I was just blown away by the people who did surround me and kind of help elevate that platform. And 7,000 people voted for me.
Oh, well, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, it wasn't enough to actually get the seat,
Yeah.
but 7,000 households in this city are in our camp. We know that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Unfortunately, like I think in Newfoundland and Labrador, we're still a little bit in the grip of. I say that the merchant class in some ways has morphed into a corporate class. Um, Another example of what I mean by that is after many, many years of waiting, like decades of waiting for a contemporary accessibility legislation in Newfoundland and Labrador, our provincial government held almost 2 years of consultations with the disabilities community that concluded last year with a completed document. And the document was completed in mid-November and was to be introduced to the public and signed off on in the House of Commons on International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which is in the first week of December.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in that brief window of time between the middle of November and the 3rd of December, without any notice to the disabilities community whatsoever, a secret consultation was heard with the business community, and the
Mm.
legislation was altered without our consent, without a single voice of disability in the room,
Oh, that's sad. That's really is
right? So
yeah,
that
it's
happened
pathetic. That's pathetic.
2024. That's 2024.
My God.
And this morning, Um, now I have many, like I do understand the value of local small businesses, but I have to tell you that this morning as I listened to the news about impending tariffs from America and the big impact that's going to have on our economy, particularly our local economy, and how important it was to support local, there was a bubble over my head going, but does local support me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Definitely. Yeah.
Right?
Definitely. Yeah.
Right?
Mm. Yeah.
30% of the population.
Mm. And knowing that knowing all of the work that you do to to advocate and support people with not only people with with visual impairment. What what keeps you going? What motivates you? Because I'm sure that you must get disheartened sometimes. But what what drives you?
I think I can't not do it. To me, it's
Okay.
almost like a moral imperative. I know like that sounds just so stodgy, but it's like because I can, Greg, because I can, because there are so many people who I know. Like there are a lot of silencing mechanisms at play too. You know, disability, like internalized ableism, which is which can manifest in many ways. Like you mentioned earlier, how difficult it has been for you as a person with a communication difference, that it can be, if you allow it to be, a source of embarrassment or a source of shame. That is not unusual. I know many people who have battled with that, like those same kind of internal, you want to be perceived as just like everybody else, right? And because, there's that, the widespread poverty. Nobody wants to talk about their poverty. Nobody wants anybody in their family worried about them or their ability to live an independent life to be questioned. So, and it's not easy to talk about very, very personal things in public. And I just kind of look back over my life, and everything that anybody could take away from me has already been taken, right? The sight is gone, it's not coming back. The opportunities are gone that I had hoped for, like continued full employment. So I have a freedom that many other people may not have. I can say the hard things, and there's nothing anybody can take from me. I don't care about friends in high places. I don't care about financial opportunities. I care more about the people in this community than I do about any of those things. So that's why I
Mm-hmm.
do it.
Mm-hmm. And what can the community do do to support you? Like what can we do? With 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 some sort of law with blocks. I'm also the chair of the Newfoundland Labrador Starting Association. So what can we do to advocate and support your causes?
I want to elevate the conversation beyond just talking about there needs to be a ramp on that building, or there needs to be an audible crosswalk over there, or we need to have a quiet room for people who might need sensory relief. in certain situations. All those things are very important, but we have to get to talking to about the things that have that lie behind those vacancies. Why is it that in Newfoundland and Labrador, after nearly 100 years of advocacy, we are still easily 50 years behind the rest of the country? So I want to create a space where we can actually learn from each other, educate each other, because I've learned from other advocates and they've learned from other advocates. This stuff is not necessarily, you're not going to find a formula in a book necessarily,
Definitely.
right?
That's right. That's right, Anne. Definitely.
Yeah, and it
Mm.
has to be very specific to the social, political, and cultural environment that you are in.
Being a person who stutters, and I feel that, and I mean, I'm also, speaking on behalf of the Newfoundland Labrador Stuttering Association and all the community of people studying in Newfoundland Labrador. It's there's very little attention has been paid or given to stuttering. Very little attention. And so, I mean, very little attention has been given to the physical component of stuttering, like my repetitions and blocks. But less attention is paid to the mental health issue of stuttering. So we your challenges is so similar to what ours are as well. We're trying to advocate and for our rights, and for financial support for speech therapy, and when because I actually retired in 2017, and after a 35-year career with the city. But when I moved to Newfoundland, I was looking for support because I had a lot of support for stuttering in Ontario. But I was surprised, and there's very little known about stuttering. Not to negate the work of the speech language pathologist, but there's no formal support, and it's almost like much like you. So what we're trying to do as a small association is trying to get attention. We're trying to get stuttering under the lens and into the schools as well. But it's like rolling a square. What's the old saying? Like a square stone up a hill, And it seems sometimes I think no one's listening, but listening to you, and I applaud you working with this group to come together as a whole to advocate for the LGBT community, visually impaired, the those that communicate differently. Because I think part of the problem is we're working in silos. We're working in silos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
solidarity, I believe, is really, really important. And we all learn from each other. Um, Man, I've met such magnificent people in the disabilities community, in the neurodiverse community, in the communication diverse community, in the deaf community. It's amazing. Um,
Mm.
and it's also like when we hear people like wringing their hands about the lack of workers, I just want to throw up my hands. Not that I think every person should work. I'm not saying that, because there are many people who may not have the desire or the capacity to, and that's fine. And we also have to work out what is work changing the model of what employment is, like flexible workplaces, accommodating workplaces, all that kind of thing. But it really, like, there is so much potential that goes undeveloped, unappreciated, and just not recognized. That's sitting right under everybody's nose.
So, Anne, how far along are you with developing this group? What was the group's name again? Coalition.
We're just going to be calling it a sort of a disability justice pod
Okay.
for the moment, but our goal is to create a space that will exist both virtually and in-person spaces where we can talk very frankly and openly about our lives and our aspirations and what it is that we want to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
And we have through a network of social justice co-ops that extend right across, well, right around the Western world. We do have access to specialists, like we have access to legal advice, like what are our human rights? Like what does that mean in any particular situation? What is your human right to education, right? What does that mean, like in a very practical way?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I totally agree with what you say about the silos. We call ourselves a community, and we are, but in many ways we don't know each other. The blind people are all over there somewhere under, one
Mm-hmm.
institutional banner, and the deaf folks are over there, and the autism people are over there, and people with speech differences uh, in another little silo. And that's kind of also like that is that in itself is a system that does not work for us; it works against us,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And we cannot depend on disability organizations to do it for us because, well, for a few reasons. The first is that my experience with many, not all, but especially what I like the legacy organizations, let's just say the really old institutional ones. If you look at their job postings, they're looking for administrators, they're looking for marketing and communications people, they're looking for fundraisers, they're looking for people with executive organizational skills. You don't see anything in these job postings that talk about a working knowledge of critical disability theory, right? But if you don't have that understanding of how these systems are all kind of conspiring against us, then you're just repeating the same old stuff over and over again. Nothing is going to change. The other thing is that most of those organizations, their sustaining funds come from government. So they are not going to be contentious. They are not going to, they're not going to do anything or say anything to jeopardize their funding,
Of course,
right?
definitely.
And I understand that. But I have the freedom to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And people who don't work, but we need a circle of support around us.
Definitely,
We
definitely.
need
Yeah.
circles of support around us because you are stepping out on a limb. It's a small province. People know people. Some people may fear some kind of retaliation. And I'm not going to say that's not valid. It's valid to them. So and we need emotional support. Um, I totally agree with you that the impacts on mental health from living a diverse experience is very real. Um, and we don't have, I mean, we have a very strange mental health system anyway. But the reason why I wanted to go to university, in fact, was to do a degree in clinical psychology so that I could take my disabled experience into the counseling world. Because just as it would be for a black woman to approach a counselor who is probably a white person, like where do you begin? For me, there are many times in my disabled experience when I could have used the support of a counselor, but if they don't understand ableism and they don't understand what you're up against, and they don't understand like these daily interactions that you're having, these diminishing interactions, then
Mm-hmm.
I don't need someone to tell me that my attitude will determine my altitude kind of stuff, right? Because that's
Mm.
not true.
I know what you're saying, and because I mean, we all have, when I hear things like that, I think of, I mean, the mental health issues related to any disability is like an onion.
Yeah.
there's so many layers and so many layers because of the you know discrimination, being devalued, things like that. But you see, and sadly, we need specialized support, which is just not there. It's just not there, and you know.
There's something else I really want, because I've really been beating this drum a lot whenever I can. But I just like to bring it up here because we have a broad listening audience. Right now in Canada, under the Medical Assistance in Dying program, which personally I fully support that program for people who have terminal illnesses or who live with extreme suffering. I think it's a very valid program for that purpose. However, at this time in Canada, any person with a disability, whether that disability is one that is the source of extreme physical or mental or emotional pain or not, any person with a disability can apply for medical assistance in dying in Canada. And there have been at least two documentaries that I know of that have been produced in Canada. One by CTV called Fatal Flaws, which is available on YouTube. I'm going to repeat that. The CTV documentary Fatal Flaws, available on YouTube. And the Fifth Estate episode entitled A Complicated Death have exposed the fact that persons with disabilities in Canada have been granted acceptance into the Medical Assistance in Dying program, not because they have horribly painful disabilities, but in some cases because they're living in unbearable poverty.
Okay.
The Canadian public needs to know this. Uh,
Mm.
the Fifth Estate episode opens with the case of a young man in his early 20s who happens to be blind. He has diabetes, and the blindness arises from his diabetes. So he was recently blind when this happened. Had just gotten this guide dog, was living at home, a university student, whose mother found the letter that he received from MAID telling him that yes, they would accommodate him with a medical assisted death, and had his family not found this, they would never have known until someone called them to pick up his remains.
Mm.
That's where we're at in Canada.
Oh my God.
The CTV documentary of Fatal Flaws, which
Okay.
looks at various medical assisted dying programs in Europe and in North America, opens. This documentary opens in St. Anthony, Newfoundland, where we
That's
learn of a young woman living there with cerebral palsy who, a couple of years ago, in the midst of the pandemic, but she did not have COVID, she has cerebral palsy. She ended up in the hospital in St. Anthony, and she had a lot of respiratory issues. Um, but she had been down this road before. Like this is something that has happened to her before in her life, and she's recovered. And a doctor at the hospital who was treating her, he opened up with her a conversation about whether or not she wanted a medical assisted death. Do you know how sick you are? Do you know how
Mm.
sick you are? And this is what we can do for you. First of all, what he did is outside of the protocols. That is,
Definitely.
the doctor is never to be the person to like extend that offer. It needs to be on the request of the patient, not the other way around.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, the long and short of it is her mother, who was her advocate, found out, and um, the young woman in question is living her best life still in St. Anthony. She did recover as she always had,
Oh, wonderful.
right? But had that doctor had their way, she would not be alive today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And these are the cases we're hearing about.
My God.
So my question, to the Canadian public is this acceptable to us? That we have a government who refuses to entertain a living income for a disabled person and would prefer a medical assisted death for that person. And given the history of eugenics in Canada, which, by the way, is the birthplace of eugenics, we exported it to Germany, not the other way around. Is it coming back?
My God.
And
And God. Oh,
you
sorry.
sound
Okay.
paranoid, but if they're
Yeah.
really out to get you, is it paranoia?
My God. Thanks a lot, Anne, for bringing this to our listeners' attention. Because I mean, you're right. Because we actually need to know this information. You know, we certainly do. So, and we will have to close now, but we will be doing another part 2 or 3 because I still have lots of questions for you. But and thank you very much for taking the time to to have this conversation today. Really appreciate it, Anne. I
I'm
really
really
do.
grateful for the opportunity, Greg. Thank you so much.
Now, Anne, do you have any any last words you'd like to share to our listeners?
I'd like to
Anything?
speak to anybody who's listening who lives this life of being an atypical person in a world that doesn't yet recognize our value, to say that you are valuable. We do see you, and we do have hope. There is hope. But the first thing that has to be done is what I'm trying to do today, which is tell the truth, the whole truth, as the good, the bad, and the ugly about what this really, really is. And it is entirely discriminatory, and it's no longer acceptable.
Some Stutter Law is brought to you today with help from Memorial University, the Newfoundland Labrador Stuttering Association, and a whole team of volunteers behind the scenes, without whom today's episode would not have been possible.